Hello, this is Ethan. This is my channel, Gringo Campesino, here on another beautiful day in Colombia. But I have a slightly more dramatic topic for today, and it is the protests in Latin America and how frequently foreigners react to them. So for those of you who might not know, protesters have more or less locked down the economy for the last 2 weeks in Panama. And this has caused some real problems and some backlash, especially by an older dual citizen from the US. He, according to the news, he has lived in Panama for multiple years. He has citizenship in Panama, but he got really frustrated in Panama by one of the blockades by protesters who are shutting down the Pan-American highway in Interamericana in Panama. And there are more than 20 roadblocks, if I understand. And these protesters were not allowing him to pass. Thus, he was kept away from his home. He couldn't get home. He got really frustrated. And like many Latin Americans believe Americans will react, he pulled a gun and he shot 2 protesters dead in response to them blocking his way. So I think this says a lot both about Panamanians and Americans, but the perspective I want to talk about is what you should do as a foreigner living in Panama or Colombia, how you should react, how you should prepare for these situations. Not so much a play-by-play, like if you see a roadblock, do this, but no, more just like what are the cultural realities to living in countries that have this type of protest. So first, I want to say that the American, he probably sees himself in a context of defending his right to movement. So Panama kind of have a stereotype of having a lot of libertarian-like people moving to Panama, and especially in the last 20 years. A lot of people move there to have a cheaper life, but also Panama kind of gave some freedom that some countries like Costa Rica didn't. Costa Rica, in my experience, seemed to be, at least 15 years ago when I lived there, seemed to have more of the eco-warrior type person, more of the person who wanted to escape to nature, whereas Panama had more, like I said, the libertarian types. So I think this person feels that he probably was doing what was right. I'm not really here to debate the rights and wrongs of the situation, but I can say I don't think he was doing anything. I don't think he thinks he was doing anything extremely wrong. It was kind of one of those situations where I think he just had enough of it. It seemed like he was very calm. He demanded something from the protesters who he thought were doing something illegal, and he told them to move out of the way. I think he was feeling he was probably being somewhat patriotic, making the protesters respect other people's freedoms. But in the end, he shot dead 2 protesters. And you know, obviously I don't want anyone to get killed, but I don't think anyone in the media is really talking about it from that perspective. The other side that I think the media is getting wrong is the perspective of the Panamanians. At least the media that I have seen, English-speaking media, has said and named the protesters basically eco-protesters, so environmental protesters. And I think in the Western world, they're tying them together with like the nut jobs who will destroy priceless artwork in protest for the Stop Oil movement, or the people who will glue their hands to the pavement on a runway. And though I do think we need political action to help the world's problems, I think these protesters are doing more harm than good in the Western world. I think it's a little bit more complicated in Panama. and Colombia. I will give my point right off the bat. I think most of these protests that block down roadways are creating more people who dislike the protesters than they are doing positive change. I have had this situation where I couldn't get fuel, I couldn't leave. I was stuck in a city here in Colombia for quite a long time. And even though I supported their cause, it was hard to support them in reality because they were just destroying my livelihood and destroying my freedom of movement. So I think protesters often are just doing what has always been the style of protesting, and they're not really thinking about the utility of their style of protest. So there's kind of the two sides there. In Panama, because I did live there for a long time, I think you have to understand that the protests are not necessarily environmental. I think that's the trigger, but I think it's mostly a protest of corruption. Panamanians have seen for many years environmental regulations being used to restrict the normal people from gaining from natural resources, but it seems like rich people can do whatever they want. So when I say rich people, I mostly mean politically connected people. One example I can give, when I was there probably 6 or 7 years ago, it was in the news, where there were politicians who got the rights to clear mangrove forests to create beach resorts. And I don't know if the resort was actually created, but they were demolishing and clearing mangrove forest. Mangroves are extremely important to coastal resources. But because they were politicians, they were allowed to do that. Normal people were not allowed to do that. Normal people can and will get confronted and punished for clearing mangroves. So I think it's a corruption issue in first and foremost in Panama. The second part is indigenous rights. So the places where most of this mining takes place has a high population of indigenous people, and I think they are often respected as stewards of the land. And so even people who are not connected in any way to indigenous people, they feel like their rights should be protected. So that I agree with as well. There's also a little bit of a problem with the protests, and this goes along with my thought that is ineffective and sometimes hypocritical. Frequently, when people are protesting, they don't really know what they're protesting, and they don't really know the science behind these disasters that they're protesting. For example, I have been told by many people in Panama and Colombia here that reservoirs create earthquakes. And there's a small possibility of that being the case, with more pressure on the surrounding landscape from the weight of the water. But it's generally an oversimplification, because the way it is often explained to people is almost in a mythological way, in which people are using analogies to explain environmental topics, because many people don't bother to learn the science or have the incapacity to understand the science. One perfect example here in Colombia is bamboo. People are frequently told that bamboo creates water. Well, that's obviously not true. The analogy is used because it's harder to understand, it's hard to explain to people that the root system of bamboos help bring water from deep down through capillary action, and that it is helping the surrounding landscape. So, in a very simplistic way, it does help bring water to the surface, but it obviously does not create water. So it's part of the explanations of these environmental topics is lost in the explanation. Part of the explanation is a problem. So a lot of people are protesting things that they don't really know about. In the case of this mine, it is an open pit mine, but people in Panama don't really understand frequently, the average person. I don't think they fully understand the connection between the economy and getting their free stuff. Panamanians pay very little taxes. The government makes a lot of money from the canal. And so I think people for generations have been disconnected from the economics and the growth of the country that they live in. I have to add some illegal activity in there as well. A lot of the Colombian drug money used to be filtered, maybe still is filtered through Panamanian banks. So, I'm not saying the protesters are wrong, but I do think their methods are wrong and their reasoning is sometimes misunderstood or misguided. So this old guy, I don't know his rationale, but he definitely thought that it was a violation of his rights and he was sick of seeing it happen. So he took it into his own hands. If you move down here, obviously don't do that. You don't want to spend the rest of your life in jail. He murdered 2 people. He was very calm about it. He's a lawyer. I think he really knew what was happening. He just decided enough is enough, and he was going to stand up. I think he probably thought that if he doesn't do it, someone else will. So, or maybe he thought that nobody else would. He would be the only person willing to do it, what's needed. So the things I want you to take away from this point are how you should react or how you should plan if you're going to move down to Latin America. So first and foremost, remember, the reaction to stress is a little bit different down here. I guess you could say it's similar to like the Black Lives Matter protests. In many ways, those did not achieve what they aimed to achieve. And so you can say it's not, unique to Panama or South America, these protests that are not actually doing what they want them to do. I think it's common around the world. I do support the right to protest, but I also support the right of movement and my right to go to work. And then a lot of people, including Panamanians, would like the idea of moving towards electric cars, but this mine is a copper mine, so it's very much needed for electric cars. So it's not in my backyard problem like we see in many countries. So if you move down here, one, know what you're getting into. Panama, there's one road. So if that's blocked, you're stuck for a while. My friends who live there right now, they can't get food in the supermarkets. They all have farms, so I think they're fine. But it must be very frustrating. When it's happened here in Colombia, I can tell you for sure, I was extremely frustrated. So know what you're getting into. 2, you have to be adaptable. I think it's a mistake. A lot of people in the United States, they have less than 1 day worth of food in their house if you're living in a center of a city, especially cities like New York. If I understand right, cities like New York, London, Paris, parts of LA, there's a total of 3 days worth of food because it's last minute delivery. So if you move down here, take advantage of your beautiful surroundings. Make sure you have some fruit trees. Make sure you have some crops planted. So if things do shut down for a while, you got food. I personally have probably 30 kilos of rice at my farm, just in case something happens. If I can't leave for a while, I can be sure that I'm not going to starve. Here in this climate, I don't have to worry about heating or cooling. So really, I would miss out on work online, but if I have no electricity, it's really not going to affect my health. So adapt. The other point is remember that you are not representing only yourself. If you're back in your home country, you get into a fight at a bar, or me, I had a small confrontation in the gym the other day. I was fully aware that I was representing foreigners. I am the only gringo in my town. I was not afraid of this person in a physical manner. He was much smaller than me. But, he considers himself the cool kid in town. And, I could hear him under his breath, swearing at me, fucking gringo type thing. If I confronted him, it would not be two guys having a fight. It would be the gringo fighting a local. And that's what everyone would talk about. And, I've done a very good job, I think, so far of making people like me and respect me here because of my actions. And I don't want to ruin that with a small altercation. So remember, that American that shot those people, there have only been a few major instances of Americans getting in the news in Panama. One, I think it was maybe 15 years ago, the only serial killer in Panama history, or at least modern history, was an American killing people in Bocas del Toro, if I remember right. And now they have this bad opinion about Americans. And even though he's dual citizen, he's a Panamanian, they're still going to think of him as a crazy gringo with a gun. And that doesn't help the rest of us moving down to Latin America. That's why I've said before, I am very willing to help people move down here if I think you're honest about it. But I really don't want other gringos in my town. I don't want to be seen as a stereotype that they're going to bring with them. So I want to make my own reputation. I can say I have had problems with police in Panama. I actually had a policeman pull a gun on me because I was frustrated with him because I know he was trying to get a bribe out of me. I confronted him. I didn't realize he was trying to put handcuffs on me. Honestly, he was another little guy. So I kind of just ignored it, not realizing what he was doing. And he saw that as resisting, and he pulled his gun on me. And so everything worked out, but the point of the story is his commanding officer came and basically had no concept of right and wrong. Over more than any other feeling, he just wanted to insult Americans. He just kept on telling me, you Americans think you can do whatever you want. Your country is full of drug addicts and criminals and people running around with guns. So he obviously had been influenced by the news and his interactions with other foreigners. So remember, you are representing your country when you move and you're in the minority. And I guess that goes for immigrants going to the U.S. as well. I grew up with a lot of Mexican immigrants, and I understand now there's about 1 million Venezuelans in the U.S., so make sure, if any of you are listening, make sure you're representing your country well. And the last point, and I've said this before, don't come here only for financial reasons. If you're moving to Latin America, Colombia, Panama, if you're only coming here because you're trying to escape the cost of the U.S. or Europe, you're going to fail on so many levels. Make sure you want to be here. I don't want to see more people down here feeling like they're stuck because they sold their house in the U.S., they bought some property in Panama, they lost half of their money because they don't know how to handle themselves, they got conned by workers here, they got conned by various groups because you had to build your house twice because the first time was done incorrectly. And then you can complain and complain and complain. In Panama, there's Gringo groups. There's whole communities that were housing divisions that were sold to mostly expats, and they're full of retirees. All they do on the weekend is sit together and get drunk and complain about how much Panama sucks. If you don't want to be in Panama, you should have never come. So if you don't want to be in Colombia, or if your only reason is financial, don't come. Make sure you love where you're going more than you hate where you're coming from. So that's the major point with all of this. It's, you know, the topic is the protests and the reason behind the protests, but this reaction that this guy had, I wasn't surprised at all. A little disheartened by it, but I'm not surprised because I see that mentality in a lot of gringos down here. So remember what you're getting into, love where you're going, integrate into the community, and be adaptive. Just roll with the punches. So if you have any questions or if you need any help, any topics you want me to talk about, write in the comments. Thanks.